The Spanish-American War. Prologue. The war that made America an empire. The 19th century was dying, and with it, the old order of the world. For nearly 400 years, the Spanish Empire had cast a long shadow across the globe. Its ships had crossed oceans, its armies had conquered kingdoms, and its colonies had stretched from the Americas to the islands of the Pacific. But by the late 1890s, Spain was no longer the terrifying imperial giant of earlier centuries. It was weakened by debt, political instability, military decline, and colonial rebellion. Only a few jewels of empire remained. Cuba and Puerto Rico still stood under the Spanish flag in the Caribbean. Guam and the Philippines remained under Spanish control in the Pacific. But these territories were no longer signs of unstoppable power. They were the last possessions of an empire struggling to survive. Cuba was the most important. Known as the Pearl of the Antilles, Cuba lay only 90 miles from the coast of Florida. Its sugar plantations generated enormous wealth. Its harbors mattered to trade and strategy. Its location made it impossible for the United States to ignore. But Cuba was also a land of rebellion. For decades, Cuban revolutionaries had fought against Spanish rule. They wanted independence, representation, dignity, and control over their own future. Spain promised reform, delayed reform, and then answered rebellion with force. By 1895, the island was burning again. The Cuban struggle for independence became one of the great crises of the age. It drew in exiles, guerrilla fighters, Spanish generals, American newspapers, businessmen, politicians, and finally the United States Navy. The war that followed would last only a few months, but its consequences would reach far beyond Cuba. Spain would lose the remains of its overseas empire. Cuba would gain independence, but not full freedom from American influence. Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines would pass into American hands. Theodore Roosevelt would rise from a battlefield hero to a national political force. And the United States would step onto the world stage not merely as a republic, but as an imperial power. The Spanish-American War began with a cry for Cuban liberty. It ended with America facing a new and uncomfortable question. Could a nation born in revolt against empire become an empire itself? Chapter 1. Cuba burns. Cuba had long been one of Spain's most valuable colonies. Its plantations produced sugar for the world. Its ports connected the Caribbean to the Atlantic. Its wealth helped support a Spanish state that was no longer as powerful as it had once been. For Madrid, losing Cuba was unthinkable. It would not only be an economic disaster, it would be a humiliation. But to many Cubans, Spanish rule had become unbearable. The island had already endured the 10 Years' War from 1868 to 1878, a brutal and exhausting struggle for independence. That war failed to free Cuba, but it left behind veterans, networks, bitterness, and a revolutionary tradition. Spain promised reforms, but those promises disappointed many Cubans. Political exclusion, heavy taxation, and colonial control continued. Out of this frustration emerged José Martí. Martí was a poet, journalist, thinker, and revolutionary. He spent years in exile, much of it in New York. Organizing Cubans abroad, and giving language to the independence movement. His dream was not simply to remove Spain. He wanted a free Cuban republic built on justice, dignity, racial equality, and national self-determination. Martí also understood the danger of the United States. He admired parts of American democracy, but he feared American expansion. He warned that Cuba must win independence before the powerful nation to the north decided to control the island for itself. In 1895, Martí returned to Cuba to join the rebellion. He was killed soon after at the Battle of Dos Rios. His death made him a martyr. His words and memory became part of the soul of the Cuban cause. The fighting continued under leaders such as Máximo Gómez and Antonio Maceo. Cuban rebels fought as guerrillas. They knew Spain's army was stronger in conventional battle, so they attacked the island's economic foundations. Sugar plantations were burned. Railroads were destroyed. Supply lines were cut. If Cuba could not produce wealth, Spain would pay dearly to keep it. Spain responded with growing desperation. In 1896, General Valeriano Weyler was sent to crush the rebellion. Weyler believed the rebels survived because civilians in the countryside fed them, sheltered them, and gave them information. His solution was reconcentration. Hundreds of thousands of rural Cubans were forced from their homes into guarded towns and camps controlled by the Spanish military. Anyone outside these zones could be treated as an enemy. The policy was meant to separate civilians from rebels, but it created a humanitarian catastrophe. The camps became crowded and unsanitary. Food was scarce. Disease spread quickly. Families lost farms, homes, animals, and livelihoods. Many civilians died from hunger, illness, and exposure. Weyler became known in the American press as the Butcher. Stories of suffering crossed the water to the United States. Cuban exiles, missionaries, business people, diplomats, and journalists carried accounts of the camps and the war. Some reports were accurate, some were exaggerated, but the reality was severe enough. Cuba was in agony, and Americans were paying attention. For many Americans, the Cuban struggle seemed familiar. A colony was fighting for liberty against a European empire. The memory of the American Revolution gave the story emotional power. How could the United States, born in rebellion against imperial rule, ignore a similar struggle so close to its shores? Humanitarian sympathy mixed with strategic interest. American businesses had investments in Cuba. American politicians worried about instability near Florida. American naval thinkers saw the Caribbean as vital to national security. American expansionists believed the United States had a destiny beyond its continental borders. Cuba became more than an island. It became a test of American identity. Chapter 2. The War of Headlines. In the 1890s, newspapers were mass entertainment, political weapons, and business empires. New York City was the center of a fierce circulation war between Joseph Pulitzer's New York World and William Randolph Hearst's New York Journal. Both publishers understood that drama sold papers. Huge headlines, emotional illustrations, scandal, crime, and war could turn a newspaper into a national force. The Cuban crisis gave them everything they needed. The suffering of Cuban civilians, the cruelty of Spanish military policy, the romance of rebels in the hills, and the possibility of war all became daily material for the American press. The papers showed starving families, heroic insurgents, brutal Spanish officers, and a helpless island crying out for rescue. This style became known as yellow journalism. It did not invent the crisis in Cuba. Spain's repression was real. Civilian suffering was real. But yellow journalism simplified, intensified, and dramatized the story. It reduced a complex colonial war into a moral play. Spain as villain, Cuba as victim, America as potential savior. Hearst and Pulitzer competed to make their papers more emotional, more urgent, and more sensational. Illustrators created vivid scenes for readers who had never seen Cuba. Headlines demanded outrage. Reports of atrocities appeared again and again. One famous story, often repeated, claimed that when artist Frederick Remington told Hearst there would be no war, Hearst replied, "You furnish the pictures, and I'll furnish the war." The exact truth of the quote is debated, but the legend captured what many believed about the Yellow Press, that it did not merely report war fever. It helped feed it. President William McKinley watched this storm with caution. McKinley was not eager for war. He was the last Civil War veteran to serve as president, and he understood what battle truly meant. He had seen the dead. He knew war was not a parade or a headline. He preferred diplomacy, pressure, and negotiation. He pushed Spain to recall Weyler, end reconcentration, and grant Cuba reforms. Spain, weakened and under pressure, eventually recalled Weyler and offered limited autonomy. For a moment, peace seemed possible. But the Cuban rebels wanted full independence, not reform inside the Spanish Empire. Spanish loyalists in Havana were angry at concessions. American public opinion was already heated. The situation remained unstable. Then came the Delome letter, a private letter written by Enrique Dupuy Delome, the Spanish minister to the United States, was published in the American press. In it, he insulted McKinley, describing him as weak and politically driven. The insult outraged Americans. Spain apologized, and Delome resigned. But the damage was done. The letter made diplomacy look like humiliation. Only days later, a far greater shock came from Havana Harbor. Chapter 3. Remember the Maine? In January 1898, unrest in Havana worried American officials. To protect American citizens and interests, McKinley sent the battleship USS Maine to Havana Harbor. Officially, it was a friendly visit. In reality, it was a signal. The Maine was a floating symbol of American power, a steel warship anchored in Spanish-controlled waters. It did not fire a shot. It did not deliver an ultimatum. But everyone understood its meaning. The United States was watching. For 3 weeks, the Maine sat in the harbor. On the night of February 15, 1898, the water was calm. Many sailors were asleep below decks. At Noapatrzech, p.m., a massive explosion tore through the forward section of the ship. Fire smoke and twisted steel erupted into the night. The blast shattered the ship and lit the harbor. The Maine sank into the muddy water. 266 American sailors and Marines died. The news struck the United States like a thunderbolt. before any complete investigation could settle the cause. Many newspapers blamed Spain. Hearst's Journal and Pulitzer's World poured fuel on the anger. Diagrams, theories, accusations, and emotional headlines filled the front pages. The cry spread across the nation. Remember the Maine. Spain denied responsibility. McKinley urged calm and waited for an inquiry. But public anger grew stronger every day. The Naval Court of Inquiry concluded that an external explosion, likely a mine, had destroyed the ship. Later investigations and historians would debate the cause for more than a century, with some arguing that an internal accident may have been responsible. But in 1898, nuance could not compete with outrage. The Maine had become a symbol. For war supporters, it proved Spanish treachery. For newspapers, it was the perfect rallying cry. For politicians, it made hesitation look weak. For the public, it turned a distant Cuban crisis into an American tragedy. McKinley still resisted war as long as he could. He knew the army was not fully prepared. He knew war might expand in unpredictable ways. But he was increasingly isolated. Congress, the press, and a large part of the public demanded action. Assistant Secretary of the Navy Theodore Roosevelt was among the loudest voices for a stronger response. Roosevelt believed war could strengthen national character and announce America's arrival as a great power. He saw Spain as weak and the moment as historic. To him, hesitation looked like cowardice. By April, McKinley concluded that intervention could no longer be avoided. He asked Congress for authority to use force in Cuba. Congress passed the Teller Amendment, promising that the United States would not annex Cuba and would leave the island to its people after pacification. This framed the coming war as a war of liberation, not conquest. But war with Spain could not remain confined to Cuba. Spain was a global empire. Its weaknesses stretched across the oceans. And before the first major American troops fought in Cuba, the United States would strike Spain on the other side of the world. Chapter 4. Manila Bay. The Philippines lay thousands of miles from the Caribbean, across the Pacific Ocean. For centuries, Spain had ruled the islands. But like Cuba, the Philippines had its own independence movement. Filipino revolutionaries wanted freedom from Spanish rule. And, by the time war came, Spain's hold on the islands was already under pressure. Theodore Roosevelt, while serving in the Navy Department, had helped prepare for a Pacific strike. Commodore George Dewey, commander of the American Asiatic Squadron, was stationed at Hong Kong. If war began, he was to sail for the Philippines and destroy the Spanish fleet in Manila Bay. When war became official, Dewey acted quickly. His squadron crossed the South China Sea. On the night of April 30, 1,898 American ships entered Manila Bay under cover of darkness. Spanish shore batteries failed to stop them. As dawn rose on May 1, Dewey's fleet approached the Spanish squadron near Cavite. The Spanish ships were older, weaker, and poorly prepared. The American ships were more modern and more effectively commanded. Dewey stood aboard his flagship, the Olympia. As the range closed, he gave the famous command, "You may fire when you are ready." Gridley, American guns opened fire. For hours, Dewey's ships moved in formation, firing into the Spanish fleet. The Spanish fought back, but they were badly outmatched. Their shells did little damage. Their ships burned, broke, and sank. By noon, Spain's Pacific Fleet had been destroyed. American combat losses were astonishingly low. The victory was overwhelming. Manila Bay shocked the world. The United States had destroyed a European fleet thousands of miles from its own coast. It had shown that its new steel navy could project power across oceans. European capitals now had to take American power seriously. At home, Dewey became a hero overnight. But the victory created a problem. The United States had destroyed Spanish power in the Philippines. But what would replace it? Filipino revolutionaries, led by Emilio Aguinaldo, believed they were fighting for their own independence. Many hoped American victory would help end Spanish rule and open the way for a Filipino republic. The United States had entered the war, speaking of Cuban freedom. Now it stood in possession of power in Asia. The question was no longer only whether Spain should lose an empire. The question was whether America would take one. Chapter 5. The Army goes to Cuba. While the Navy moved with speed, the American Army struggled. The regular army was small and scattered. It had experience on the western frontier, but it was not prepared for a major overseas campaign. Volunteers poured into camps, eager to fight. The enthusiasm was real, but organization was poor. The main staging point was Tampa, Florida. There, confusion ruled. Supplies piled up in the wrong places. Food spoiled. Equipment was lost. Soldiers received heavy wool uniforms for a tropical campaign. Medical planning was inadequate. Disease began to spread before many men even reached Cuba. Among the volunteer units was the 1st United States Volunteer Cavalry, better known as the Rough Riders. The Rough Riders became one of the most famous units of the war. They included cowboys, miners, lawmen, athletes, Native Americans, and men from wealthy Eastern families. Their public image was a living symbol of the American frontier. Rough, bold, masculine, and energetic. Their most famous figure was Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt resigned from the Navy Department to fight. He helped organize the unit and threw himself into the role with enormous enthusiasm. He was ambitious, brave, theatrical, and deeply aware of the power of public image. The war would make him a national celebrity. But the reality of the campaign was less glamorous than the newspapers suggested. The Rough Riders were cavalry, but many of their horses could not be transported to Cuba. Much of the unit fought on foot. The American landing near Santiago was disorganized. Roads were poor. The jungle was thick. Heat and humidity exhausted the men. Rain turned trails into mud. Spanish soldiers were also better armed than many Americans expected. Their Mauser rifles used smokeless powder, making their positions harder to detect. American troops often fired black powder weapons that revealed their location in clouds of smoke. The first fighting at Las Guasimas showed how difficult the campaign would be. Spanish defenders used the terrain well. American units pushed forward under fire. But confusion was common. The tropical environment itself seemed like an enemy. Still, the Americans advanced. Their target was Santiago, a fortified city on Cuba's southeastern coast. A Spanish fleet under Admiral Pascual Cervera had taken refuge in Santiago Harbor. If American forces could capture the high ground around the city and trap the fleet, Spain's position in Cuba would collapse. To do that, they had to take the San Juan Heights. Chapter 6. San Juan Heights. On July 1, 1,898 American forces attacked Spanish positions outside Santiago. The key terrain included El Caney, Kettle Hill, and San Juan Hill. Spanish troops held strong defensive positions. They had blockhouses, trenches, artillery, barbed wire, and rifles that could fire accurately from concealed positions. The American plan was difficult and imperfectly coordinated. At El Caney, Spanish defenders held much longer than expected, delaying parts of the operation. Near the San Juan Heights, American troops gathered under fire, waiting for orders. Men crouched in tall grass as Mauser bullets cut through the air. Then, the advance began. The famous charge up San Juan Hill was actually a broader assault that included Kettle Hill and nearby positions. The Rough Riders played a visible role, but they did not fight alone. Regular Army troops carried much of the burden. Among them were the 9th and 10th Cavalry, African-American regiments known as Buffalo Soldiers. Their experience, discipline, and courage were crucial, though later popular memory often pushed them into the background. Under heavy fire, the Americans surged forward. The attack was not a perfect cavalry charge. It was a chaotic uphill movement by exhausted men, many on foot, pushing through heat, smoke, grass, and confusion. Officers shouted. Units mixed together. Men fell wounded on the slope. Roosevelt, mounted for part of the action, pushed forward with dramatic energy. He wanted to be at the front. And his courage was real. So was his instinct for history. He understood that a man seen leading in battle could become a man remembered by a nation. The Americans took Kettle Hill and San Juan Hill. The stars and stripes rose over the heights. From those positions, Santiago was threatened. Spanish troops had fought with determination, but they could not hold. The victory came at a cost. Hundreds of Americans were killed or wounded in the fighting. Disease would soon claim even more. But the strategic result was decisive. Santiago was now under pressure from land, and Cervera's fleet remained trapped in the harbor. The United States had won its most famous land battle of the war. The newspapers would make Roosevelt the hero of San Juan Hill. His fame would help carry him into politics. First as governor of New York, then vice president, and eventually president of the United States. But the battle was larger than one man. It was won by volunteers, regular infantry, black soldiers, cavalrymen fighting on foot, artillerymen, officers, and ordinary soldiers who climbed into fire because the campaign required it. The heights had fallen. Now, the Spanish fleet had to run or die. Chapter 7. The Fall of Santiago. Admiral Pascual Cervera knew his situation was nearly hopeless. His ships were trapped in Santiago Harbor. American forces threatened the city from land. American warships waited outside the harbor mouth. If he stayed, his fleet might be captured or destroyed in port. If he tried to escape, he would face a stronger American navy in open water. Orders from Spain pushed him to attempt a breakout. On July 3, 1,898 Cervera's ships steamed out of the harbor one by one and turned west along the coast. The American fleet was waiting. What followed was not a balanced naval battle. It was a running destruction. American battleships and cruisers opened fire. Shells slammed into Spanish vessels. Fires spread. Engines failed. Crews fought desperately to keep ships alive. But they were outmatched. One by one, the Spanish ships were driven ashore, burning and ruined. Spain's Caribbean fleet ceased to exist. With the fleet destroyed and the city surrounded, Santiago could not hold. Spanish forces surrendered in mid-July. A short American campaign in Puerto Rico followed, facing limited resistance and confirming Spain's collapse in the Caribbean. By August, an armistice ended the fighting. The war had lasted only about 10 weeks. Secretary of State John Hay famously called it a splendid little war. From a distance, many Americans saw it that way. The United States had won quickly. Combat casualties were relatively limited compared with larger wars. The Navy had triumphed in Manila Bay and off Santiago. The Army had taken the heights around Santiago. Spain had been defeated. But the phrase hid darker truths. Disease killed far more American soldiers than Spanish bullets. Camps had been poorly managed. Food and medicine had often failed. Tropical disease exposed the weakness of American military organization. For Cubans, the war was not simply an American victory. They had fought for years before U.S. troops arrived. Cuban rebels had weakened Spain, burned the economy, endured suffering, and kept the independence struggle alive. Yet they would have limited power in the peace that followed. For Spain, the defeat was a national trauma. It marked the end of the empire that had once dominated the Atlantic world. For the United States, victory raised a question larger than the battlefield. What should be done with the territories taken from Spain? The answer would define America's new role in the world. Chapter 8. The Treaty of Paris. Peace negotiations took place in Paris in late 1898. The result was the Treaty of Paris. Signed on December 10. Spain gave up its claim to Cuba. It ceded Puerto Rico and Guam to the United States. It also transferred the Philippines to the United States in exchange for $20 million. The treaty ended Spain's overseas empire. It also marked the birth of America's overseas empire. Cuba was the emotional center of the war, and the Teller Amendment had promised that the United States would not annex it. Cuba did become formally independent, but independence came with limits. The United States later forced Cuba to accept the Platt Amendment, which gave America the right to intervene in Cuban affairs and secured a naval base at Guantanamo Bay. Cuba had escaped Spain, but it remained under strong American influence. Puerto Rico became an American possession. Guam became an American possession. The Philippines became the most controversial prize of all. Filipino revolutionaries had fought Spain and expected independence. Emilio Aguinaldo and his supporters believed that a republic born from its own anti-colonial revolution would support their freedom. Instead, the United States chose to keep the islands. President McKinley argued that America could not return the Philippines to Spain, could not allow another empire to take them, and could not simply leave them in chaos. His language reflected the paternalistic and racial assumptions of the era. He claimed the United States had a duty to govern and uplift the islands. Critics called this hypocrisy. The Anti-Imperialist League formed to oppose annexation. Its members included writers, industrialists, labor leaders, reformers, and ordinary citizens. Mark Twain became one of the sharpest critics. Anti-imperialists argued that the United States could not claim to defend liberty while ruling other peoples without their consent. They asked a simple question: if government derives its just powers from the consent of the governed, how could America govern the Philippines without Filipino consent? Supporters of empire answered with strategy. They argued that the United States needed naval bases, markets, and influence. They warned that if America did not take the islands, Germany, Japan, or another power might. They believed great nations required overseas possessions. The debate revealed a deep contradiction in American identity. The United States had gone to war denouncing Spanish colonial rule. Now it was taking colonies of its own. Chapter 9. The Philippine War and the Shadow of Empire. The most tragic consequence of 1898 unfolded in the Philippines. Filipino revolutionaries had fought to free themselves from Spain. When they realized that American victory would not bring immediate independence, tension turned to conflict. In February 1899, fighting broke out between American forces and Filipino nationalists. The Philippine-American War was longer, bloodier, and far more brutal than the war against Spain. American troops fought a difficult counterinsurgency campaign across islands, towns, and jungles. Filipino fighters used guerrilla tactics. The United States responded with harsh measures, including village burnings, civilian concentration policies, and severe reprisals. Disease and famine killed many. Hundreds of thousands of Filipinos died, most from disease, hunger, and the wider consequences of war. The conflict exposed the moral cost of empire. Only months earlier, Americans had condemned Spain for reconcentration in Cuba. Now American forces used similar methods in the Philippines. The language of liberation gave way to the language of control. The Republic had become an occupying power. At home, many Americans preferred to remember the Spanish-American War as quick, noble, and victorious. The Philippine conflict was harder to celebrate. It did not fit the simple story of rescuing Cuba. It forced Americans to confront the reality that power, once acquired, often demands coercion to maintain. The war in the Philippines also foreshadowed future American struggles overseas. It raised questions that would return again and again in the 20th century. Could military victory create political legitimacy? Could the United States impose order and call it freedom? Could a country fight for democracy while denying self-government to others? The Spanish-American War had opened the door. The Philippine-American War showed what waited on the other side. Chapter 10. The Rise of Roosevelt and the American Century. The war made Theodore Roosevelt a national hero. His image as the bold leader of the Rough Riders captured the public imagination. Whether or not the popular story gave full credit to the many soldiers who fought beside him, Roosevelt understood how to turn battlefield fame into political power. After the war, he was elected governor of New York. Then, he became vice president. In 1901, after President McKinley was assassinated, Roosevelt became president. Roosevelt embodied the new America that emerged from 1898. Energetic, confident, naval-minded, and willing to use power beyond its borders. As president, he expanded American influence, supported the construction of the Panama Canal, strengthened the Navy, and sent the Great White Fleet around the world to display American strength. The Spanish-American War helped launch this new foreign policy. It also helped heal, at least on the surface, some divisions left from the Civil War. Northern and Southern soldiers served under the same flag. Former Confederates celebrated victory alongside former Union states. The war gave Americans a shared external enemy and a shared national triumph. But unity came with exclusion and contradiction. Black soldiers fought bravely in Cuba, especially the Buffalo Soldiers. Yet they returned to a country still marked by segregation, discrimination, and racial violence. Cuban and Filipino independence fighters saw their own struggles overshadowed by American narratives of rescue and victory. Puerto Ricans and Guamanians found themselves under a new flag without full equality or full self-rule. The United States had become stronger, but strength did not resolve the moral contradictions at the heart of its new power. Epilogue. The price of power. The Spanish-American War was short, but it was one of the most consequential wars in American history. It ended the Spanish Empire as a global force. It brought Cuba out from under Spanish rule. It gave the United States Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. It made America a power in the Caribbean and the Pacific. It turned the U.S. Navy into a central instrument of national policy. It helped create the conditions for the American century. For many Americans in 1898, the war felt like a triumph. The Maine had been remembered. Spain had been defeated. Cuba had been liberated from Spanish rule. Dewey had won at Manila Bay. Roosevelt had charged in Cuba. The flag now flew across oceans. But history is rarely that simple. The war began with a language of freedom and ended with the practice of empire. Cuba became independent, but under American pressure. The Philippines expected liberation and received occupation. Puerto Rico and Guam passed from one imperial ruler to another. The United States condemned Spanish colonialism while building an overseas empire of its own. The central question of 1898 did not disappear. Can a republic become an empire and remain true to itself? The Spanish-American War forced the United States to look beyond its shores. It marked the end of continental innocence and the beginning of global responsibility, global ambition, and global contradiction. The sailors of the Maine, the Cuban revolutionaries, the Spanish soldiers at Manila and Santiago, the Buffalo Soldiers on the Cuban hills, the Rough Riders who became legends, and the Filipino fighters who resisted a new ruler all became part of a larger story. It was the story of a fading empire, a rising power, and a world entering a new century. The war began in the name of liberty. It ended by revealing the price of power. And from that moment forward, the world would never see the United States the same way again.